All right, guys, here we go with section 2 for chapter 22, and we're going to be talking about Germany strengthening. So Bismarck has united Germany with his policy of blood and iron, and now he wants to continue expanding the power and wealth of Germany. The first thing he does is expand German industry. Now, Germany was already on the path to industrialization by the time it unified, and now Bismarck wanted to make it an industrial giant like the United States and Great Britain. This was actually easy to do since, like Great Britain, Germany was rich in natural resources. Natural resources need for industrialization, you think of coal, you think of iron. Germany had plenty of that. Germany was actually a bigger country than Britain, and so actually had more of its foundational resources. And as a bigger country, they also had a growing population. In 1871, it had 41 million people. Now, this graph is a little bit tricky to make out, but the black one here, okay, that's Germany. So you notice in 1871, all right, you see how it starts to really increase. That in 1830, it had less than any of these except for Italy. But then by 1890, right, it was the most populated country in Europe, and then it would continue to increase into the 1900s. This gave them a large workforce and a large market for industrial products. And lastly, Germany had a very business-friendly government. It supported the expansion of factories and industrial enterprises like railroads. It protected German businesses by making foreign-made goods more expensive. It figured that wealthy German businesses were good for the country as a whole. Now, much of Germany's growth was due to Bismarck himself, and he gained the nickname the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck didn't only want to expand German industry, he also wanted to create a very strong centralized government. Remember, centralized means bringing power into one office, namely him. He wasn't the king, right? That was the Kaiser, the emperor, but he was the guy behind the throne, really calling all the shots. And now part of building a strong centralized government was building up the military. The other was doing away with groups that could take people's loyalty away from Germany. The first one being the Catholic Church, right? So there are two fights that he's going to pick internally with groups that he thought were a threat to loyalty to the state. And the first one was Catholics. Now, Catholics made up about a third of Germany's population, but there had long been a fear among the Protestant Germans that the loyalty of Catholics was to the Pope over any government. In response to this, Bismarck launched what's called the Kulturkampf, or Battle of Civilizations. Right? You see in this political cartoon, it's being made as a chess match between Bismarck here and the Pope there on the right. Bismarck wanted to make Catholics put their loyalty to the German government above all else. Unfortunately for him, this backfired to an extent. Catholics resented the new restrictions put on them. There were a series of laws taking away certain rights and land and things like that. And Catholics eventually, because of this kind of galvanized support for them, they gained power in the government. Bismarck was forced to make peace with the church and make some compromises. Now, the other big battle for loyalty was with socialists, right? So the first one's with the Catholic Church, the next one's with socialists. Socialism was growing in the late 1800s, and Bismarck feared that socialism was taking away the loyalty of the German workers. You see how it's here, the socialist jack. He's trying to put this jack back in the box. He's really worried that people would eventually start listening to the writings of Karl Marx and so forth, and they'd rise up in rebellion. So he passed laws that dissolved socialist groups, right? Got rid of the socialist organizations, and he restricted their civil liberties. He then tried to win over the loyalty of workers by providing social welfare programs, such as health benefits, retirement plans, things that Germany didn't have. Now, this, we'd look at today as actually being somewhat more socialist, but because it would come from the government. But Bismarck was very, very kind of progressive in this sense that even though he himself in many ways was very conservative, he created a welfare state in many ways by creating these welfare programs. Now, this didn't wipe out socialism while he hoped, but it did set the standard for later social welfare programs that the government could provide. And it also showed another example of Bismarck's use of realpolitik to win over groups. He said, I don't care about my conservative, beliefs and principles. If the government is going to provide social welfare programs so people will stop turning towards socialism, so be it. Let's do it. Now, his control of the German government would end, though, when Kaiser William, or Wilhelm in German, II comes to power. Now, he felt that he didn't need to rely on Bismarck the way that his grandfather, William I, did. And in 1890, he dismissed Bismarck. He wanted to be the true master of the German Empire, and seeing himself as an absolute ruler through divine right, he resisted democratic reforms such as freedom of the press and freedom of speech and so forth. Like Bismarck, though, he did support social welfare programs, so he kept those going, a lot of the stuff that we just talked about in the previous slide, and he also supported big-time militarization. There you see him riding on his horse, and he's got all of his fancy medals on him. I mean, even in this one, these leaders in Europe at this time, they loved to make it seem like they were generals, like they knew what they were doing when it came to the military. But he continued to put more money into the expansion of Germany's army and navy. And this aggressive nationalism and militarism that you see here, this would directly lead into World War I, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. All right, so that wraps things up talking about Germany. And in the next section, we're going to be talking about how nationalism would lead to unification in Italy.